I believe very firmly that I live an ordinary life. As a blind person, my life is the same as anybody else's. It's just the tools and the techniques that I use that differ.
Please welcome Lois Strachan, writer, speaker, singer-songwriter, musician, blogger, podcaster, and an advocate for the blind.
I believe that if sighted people were more aware of how we do things, that they would then believe that we can do more.
Her new book, A Different Way of Seeing, A Blind Woman's Journey of Living an Ordinary Life in an Extraordinary Way, 2nd edition. Available on Amazon.
But people are too busy wondering about how you achieve tasks, how you live your life, and because of that, they don't actually hear your message. They're too busy trying to get past that initial, wow, she's blind. I wonder who did her makeup. Or, wow, she's blind. I wonder how she got here.
You can find Lois Strachan on the web at loisstrachan.com. LoisStrachan.com.
Surrounding yourself with people to support, encourage, assist, and motivate, and help you when you have those blockages of what do I do next is so important.
Please welcome Lois Strachan. We hope you enjoy.
I have found the writing community, the author community, the publishing community is one of the most generous communities that I've been part of.
Welcome to Blind Abilities. I'm Jeff Thompson. In the studio today, we have Lois Strachan, and she's an author and has just published the book, A Different Way of Seeing, A Blind Woman's Journey of Living an Ordinary Life in an Extraordinary Way, 2nd edition. Lois is from South Africa. Lois, welcome to Blind Abilities.
Thanks so much, Jeff, and thanks for the opportunity to chat to you today.
Well, it's a pleasure having you back on. It's been a little while.
Yeah, it has. Yeah.
Well, I think our timing's just right, and thanks for taking the time. I know you're really busy with publicizing your new book. Congratulations. Lois, I remember getting new books. I'd always turn to that part about the author and just read about it. And so this is kind of neat. We get an audio version of that. So let's dig in. Let's open the cover. Lois, your book is now in pre-order. I just pre-ordered it, and this is a 2nd edition. Why a 2nd edition?
Oh, gosh, that's actually quite a complicated story. I'll try to simplify it. I published the book originally in 2016, and as soon as I published it, I started receiving requests for an audio version of the book. And it took me a bit of time to get around to doing that. It took me about 2 years to start planning to do an audiobook. But before I went into the physical side of getting the recordings done and things like that, I thought, well, I'd better check that the content is still relevant. And it was amazing how much had changed from the time I published it to the time I was planning the audiobook. So not being able to do things simply, I thought I would update the book. And when I thought of doing that, I kind of assumed that I would land up with probably a few paragraphs of updated content for each of the chapters. Only when I wrote the updated material, I landed up with about 100 pages extra. So it just seemed to make sense, seeing as there was so much updated content and that people were still buying the book and reading the book, that I should publish the updated content as well. And rather than writing a whole new book and having 2 books and then confusing everybody, I thought, let me just release this as a 2nd edition with the updated content included.
Thus, it's continuing the journey.
In a way, yes. In some ways, I've kind of realized that there are some things that I do now that when I originally wrote the book, I kind of said were impossible, and I now do them just as a matter of course. There are a lot of things that have changed. I've become a lot more technology friendly. I'm using a lot more technology that used to intimidate me. So there are all sorts of different things that changed. And between the original book and now, I've also started working with a new guide dog, and I had a whole lot of new stories about Fiji that I thought would make great content to add into the book as well.
You lost your sight And what inspired you, or who inspired you to write the book?
Well, you make it sound like one happened and then the book resulted immediately. There's quite a long time between the two. I lost my sight at the age of 21, and I'm now a whole lot older than 21. But the inspiration for the book came really through a number of different sources. But what it comes down to is that there's so much curiosity about how we do things, the tools and the techniques that we use as the blind and visually impaired community. And the book is really a way of bridging that gap of understanding, because I believe that if sighted people were more aware of how we do things, that they would then believe that we can do more. Or if I can put that another way, because they don't understand the tools and the techniques that we use to accomplish tasks, they think that it's either really hard or impossible for us to accomplish those tasks. So the book is really a way of saying, these aren't the only techniques, these aren't the only things that people can do as members of the blind and visually impaired community, but it's just to give you an idea of how I do simple everyday tasks, how I live an ordinary life despite my blindness.
What was that like for you to review the book, knowing that you wanted to update it, a second edition, and come across things that you were thinking, oh, wow, I can do that. That's not how it is today. The journey's changed.
It was really weird. In fact, I was sitting, of all places, in a hotel in Kolkata in India when I was going through the book and making a few notes on things that, well, I thought it was going to be a few notes of things that I wanted to update. And it was only when I got to the end of that process and realized I had 22 pages of notes that I kind of realized that maybe I'd bitten off a little bit more than I originally anticipated. But it's so interesting to see the change between December 2016 and April 2019, which is when I started writing the update, and actually realize and reflect on exactly how much had changed in that time. You'd think that, 2.5, 3 years is not a long period of time, and yet so much had changed. And it really got me to kind of pause for a moment and just reflect on the fact that we probably don't recognize how much changes in our lives and how much progress that we're making because we're so busy living that life and experiencing that progress without acknowledging it and recognizing it. So it was a great experience from that perspective. Kind of could pat myself on the back and say, hey, some things have changed. I have moved forwards, but I didn't expect it to be that much.
What was one of the most extraordinary things that you found in your book? It's kind of like looking back at yourself, like you're Lois, meet Lois, 3 years ago. And what was one of the most astonishing things, I guess?
I guess the two greatest changes that I realized, one was about the technology that I'm using, things that I really avoided using 3 years ago because I was intimidated, and that I'm now using just as a matter of course. And it's silly little things. I mean, now I can see that it's silly little things. Things like using Be My Eyes, using Seeing AI, using some of the text to speech, that type of app that I just avoided using. And now it's so easy to just pick up a phone, and I'll give you a specific example. I love tea. I've never been a coffee drinker, but tea is I really enjoy different types of tea. But mostly tea comes in a box, and the boxes pretty much all look the same. So beforehand, I would just go, well, I've got to wait for my sighted husband to get home so I can figure out which box to open next.
Mm.
Now I just pull out my phone, switch on Seeing AI or one of the other apps that I use and go, it's the French vanilla and rose. Okay, got it. I can open that one.
And it's tea time.
Well, so it's something so small and yet so significant. So that's the one thing, is about the technology that I'm using and how it's added to my life. And the other thing was how much my life has changed since getting my new guide dog, Fiji. Well, she's hardly a new guide dog. I've been working with her for 3 or 4 years now. But I'd never really thought about how much of an impact that she had on my life, on my levels of independence, on the ability to get around and do the things that I want to do, which I wasn't previously.
A different way of seeing a blind woman's journey of living an ordinary life in an extraordinary way. That's quite the title.
The title, it was the hardest thing for me to do. I'm really not good about finding titles for my professional speeches and similarly for my book and for my blogs. But
It spells it right out, though.
well, yes, it does. And that was what I intended because I believe very firmly that I live an ordinary life. As a blind person, my life is the same as anybody else's. It's just the tools and the techniques that I use that differ. So in that way, I do see the world a little bit differently, just as any one of us does who has a visual impairment. The focus for me was on sharing stories about the small domestic things, the small stories, not the I'm not a person who does huge adventures like go climb Mount Kilimanjaro or anything like that. There are people who do that and they do a fantastic job and they do a huge service to the blind and visually impaired community in breaking down some of the stereotypes of what we are perceived to be able to do. But I'm not one of those people. I'm a much quieter person, although people wouldn't believe that. But for me, it was more about sharing the stories of how I live an ordinary life, even though being visually impaired or blind might be a little less than ordinary.
Mm-hmm. And that kind of leads into who the book is aimed at. I believe it's not just aimed at the blindness community. I think it's aimed at those people who have all the questions for you.
I'd love to be able to say, oh, it's aimed at everybody. Everybody should read my book. Because I think every author does think that deep down inside that everyone should read their book. But I think any marketing guru would say, well, if you try to market to everybody, you land up marketing to nobody. If I were to try and distill down to who I feel my book is aimed at, who should read my book, I think there are people from the sighted community and there are people from the blind and visually impaired community. And I think there are subgroups in each of those. So in the sighted community, it's anyone who's curious to know how I accomplish tasks, because I'm certainly not arrogant enough to say that my way is the only way of doing things. There are multiple ways that people can achieve and accomplish tasks. So this is about my way of doing things. And I think there are people who are sighted who are intrigued by some of the tools we have available, some of the techniques we use. But it's also for sighted people who have a more direct connection to visual impairment. Maybe they've got a work colleague who's visually impaired. Maybe they've got a family member, a friend, and want to know how that person does things, but are too nervous to ask. So I think those are two groups who can find benefit in the book. And the other group, which I found wasn't a specific group that when I wrote the book originally that I was aiming for, but I found there's been quite an interesting market in people who enjoy memoir and stories of people overcoming challenges. So the narrative nonfiction readers, the inspirational memoir readers. So there's been quite a pickup on that market as well. So that's the sighted community. But then if I go through to the visually impaired community, I didn't really see that there'd be much of a market amongst other people with visual impairments, because we all know how we do things. Until someone who was in the process of losing his sight mentioned to me that he read it and gained a huge amount of hope from what I shared in the book. And I think that's a very important community that I can perhaps assist in a small way. Someone who's going through the experience of losing their sight and is feeling very alone, feeling uncertain of what they're going to be able to achieve and do or not do. It just gives people a few ideas of what might be possible for them. So yeah, even though I might say, I'd love to say anybody can read the book. Of course, anybody can read the book. But I think that those are the main groups for whom it will have a particular interest.
You bring up a great point of someone that has a family member or a friend that is experiencing vision loss. I remember when I lost some vision, I didn't have any resources to go to. I was just told, from a doctor, you better check with the state. That's it. There was no book to read. There's no person to talk to or something. So this would make a great gift to someone who knows someone is going through vision loss. That's a great point. Really don't think about who exactly it's going to really affect. If anybody does know anybody that's going through vision loss, I think a book like this does give them that extra little bit of there's someone out there in the world that's done this before, and you can find more by reading this book. So that answers who should read the book. I think a lot of people would benefit, and I like that it's not directed just at the blindness community, because there's so much more education to be done in the sighted community about visual impairment. Good job on that point.
Yeah, well, I think when I wrote it, I really was aiming it at people who are sighted to fill that gap of understanding. I wrote it as a professional speaker when one of my speaking mentors said, "Your message is great, but people are too busy wondering about how you achieve tasks, how you live your life. And because of that, they don't actually hear your message. They're too busy trying to get past that initial, wow, she's blind. I wonder who did her makeup." Or, wow, she's blind. I wonder how she got here. How's she writing her speeches? So it really came out of that need. And I'm just thrilled that the value of the book is actually spread to other groups as well.
This isn't your first book. Why don't you tell the listeners the other books that are available from Lois Strachan?
I have 4 illustrated children's books called The Adventures of Missy Mouse, and they are written for children between the ages of about 3 and 8. So in the younger area, for parents to read to the children. And then as they start to learn to read themselves, that's where the kind of 7, 8-year-olds are able to still read the books. There are 4 books in the series at this stage, and they are written about a visually impaired mouse who uses her other senses to engage with the world around her. So a very similar theme, showing sighted children that someone who's blind is just a normal person who uses different tools and techniques to accomplish tasks. And if anything, I think that's kind of the niche that I'm most comfortable working in, is spreading the word about the tools and techniques that we use. Because it is so frustrating as someone who is blind to be constantly facing but how do you do this? How do you do that? I've had people who've known me for years, and only 3, 4, 5 years after I've known them, do they go, "We never realized you could use a mobile phone." So it's a way of answering questions, and the children's books are a little bit the same, but just for a younger audience.
There's the dog.
There's Allie. I don't know what she's having to say about this, but
You make a great point there, because we're always faced with that. No matter how much skills you gain, how much techniques you use to overcome the hurdles, the barriers, just to be an ordinary life. And then you run into someone that just has no clue. So you wish you could just, here's your book, read it.
Pretty much.
But a lot of people wouldn't understand if they listened to our first interview. When I first met you, you lost your eyesight, and the first thing you did was joined a rock band.
I joined a rock band, yes.
It's a long walk to somewhere, baby. Step upon step upon step upon step upon step. It's a long walk to anywhere, baby. Would you be my guide? It's there in the distance, a city paved in gold.
Joined a rock. That's not what I did. No, not at all. I went home and wondered what was going to happen. You just joined a rock band.
Well, the process of accepting
I don't know if we'll ever get there, but we have to try.
accepting blindness differs for each person. And I've always been someone who has been incredibly solutions focused. I've the skill of solving puzzles, solving problems has always been the way I approach a situation. And it really wasn't even a question for me about what was I going to do. It was all about how was I going to do it. And it just so happened that a week after returning from hospital, and I was offered a position as a backing vocalist in a rock band. And then from there picked up keyboard as well. So I think it was a good thing because I've always loved music. I've always played music. I don't have any musical training, but I've always loved playing and being part of the music. And because I was doing something that I was really passionate about, it gave me a way to just take a step back from the challenges of learning Braille, the challenges of learning O&M and mobility and things like that, having to figure out new ways of doing things. It just gave me a few moments to gather my energy, gather my breath, and just be my old self. And that was such a good thing, such a necessary thing, because it just meant that I could gather my strength and then go back to learning all those new good skills that I needed.
With every step we're getting through.
Oh, that's great. So when and how can people get hold of your book?
It's available on Amazon. If you search for A Different Way of Seeing second edition, it should come up. The pre-order is open to the public, and the book will actually be published on the 28th of October. So if you pre-order it now, it'll appear like magic on your device on the 28th of October.
I'm looking forward to that. I did my pre-order last night and I got nothing.
I'm so sorry.
But I did get the notice that I won't be charged until it ships. So I'm looking forward to receiving your book.
Yeah, that's actually a change in the way that Amazon's been doing things. Since the onset of the coronavirus, they've shifted that a little bit. So it's good to see that they're taking that into consideration.
So Lois, what now? Your book is published. You've been working on this since, I believe, March, April? Well, it's actually taken 4 years to get to this point for the second edition. So now what?
What I'm definitely not going to be doing is doing a third edition and a fourth edition. I think it's kind of reached the point where it's a good time to stop and move on to new projects. But having said that, I am still busy with the audiobook. I'm working with a phenomenal narrator who has actually been a friend of mine since we were both 3 years old. So if anybody knows how to interpret my stories, Julie will. So that's on the go at the moment. And there's just so much going on at the moment. I'm trying to find time to plan the medium-term kind of goals and targets that I want to work on. But I'm keeping myself very, very busy. In terms of writing projects, well, my guide dog Fiji, who I mentioned earlier, she writes a guest blog post for me once a month. And I'm thinking of co-authoring a book with her on her story, which I think would be a lot of fun to do. But I've also got a couple of other writing projects tucked up my sleeve. It's just I so often get caught by so many great ideas for books, but implementation becomes the problem, that I need to actually settle on one and sit down and start writing.
When you mentioned co-writing with your dog, Fiji, I was thinking Paw Prints Publishing. That's a good name for it.
It would.
I was paying attention. My mind just kind of drifts sometimes. Like,
Well, all of her blog posts that she writes are under a category called Pause for Thought, spelled PAWS.
That's clever. I like that.
It is, except Microsoft Word keeps telling me that it's a spelling correction.
Yeah, Lois, I've known you for 4 years. Is it 4 years?
Something like that.
3 years, 4 years. Can you tell the listeners a little bit of your resume? Since you've lost your eyesight, you've done some I'm going to use the word extraordinary things. They're ordinary because you just want to, you joined a rock band. But you've also been speaker, not just a speaker, but a leader, and pretty much becoming an advocate for the blind in South Africa.
I sometimes think that my journey has taken some rather unexpected pathways. And yet, when I look back at them, I can understand why I've moved from one stepping stone to the next. So, yes, when I lost my sight a week later, I joined a rock band, and music has been and is still an important part of my life. I played at part of a show at the South African National Arts Festival last year, 2019, and am a featured artist at our state theatre here in Cape Town, Artscape Theatre. They're putting on a music festival in November that I'm one of the featured artists for, that we're working on the content for that. Music has always been there, so I do a little bit of music now and then. I did 4 lockdown gigs over the last few months, which was a lot of fun, doing those on Facebook Live. So yeah, the music is very important to me. Then after joining the rock band, 3 weeks after losing my sight, I returned to university. And I lost my sight when I was halfway through my final year of my Bachelor of Arts degree. So it never occurred to me not to go back and finish my degree. And I've completed my Bachelor of Arts 10 months after losing my sight, and then went straight on to do an honors degree, which I achieved cum laude. Unfortunately, that was not in the most practical of topics. I did an honors degree in classical civilizations because I've always had a love for ancient history and literature and mythology and things like that. But it's not the greatest qualification to have to be able to get a job. So,
But it
from there,
really does add to our coffee chats.
absolutely. And it also gave me lots of content to write songs about. So there's a lot of literature and mythological illusions in my songs, which people every now and then get, what did you just mention in that song? So yeah, it's not totally valueless to me. I started working, many, many years ago, started working in the marine engineering field, working in admin, worked my way up from the receptionist through to office manager. And somewhere along the line, primarily because I used to have this fear of answering the telephone, I joined Toastmasters International as a way of becoming a more confident speaker, learning the skills of presentation, and learning a little bit of leadership development. And because I don't do anything by half measures, I jumped right into that and landed up working my way through the Toastmasters education programs and the leadership structures to head up Toastmasters Southern Africa, which at the time was leading a group of about 3,000 people in 9 different countries in Southern Africa. So like I said, it's some unusual directions perhaps, but everything does come together because after there was issues at work and a little bit of job reshuffling and change of ownership, and I landed up without a job, I decided to leap feet first into the professional speaking world. And what I'm doing now is essentially motivational speaking. I'm author, hopefully starting on my 6th book soon. I'm a blogger. I have a podcast on accessible travel called A Different Way of Traveling. You can see the theme in the names. Yeah, I do where I can. I do work within organizations to raise awareness of the tools and techniques we use more broadly than just the blindness community, but the disabled community generally. And of course, every now and then, I still am a sometime rock musician. So that's really the nutshell. But of course, there's lots of other little bits that get involved in that.
I have this saying, we may be oceans apart, but we have so much common ground that there's so much in the book. I read the first edition, and there's so much in the book from a perspective that you had then. And now the second book, that's why I ordered it, because I want to I want to see the changes, and it'll probably make me reflect in myself a little bit of sometimes we don't do that enough, is to see where we've grown to, where we've come from. And it really helps me, like in Blind Abilities, to realize that there are people who are just entering this arena, the blindness community, or they don't even know there's a community yet, that level. So it just makes you step back a second and rethink, wow, it's been a journey.
I think so often in life, we are so busy living the journey that we don't see the changes, the development, the growth. And certainly, I think that was one of the bits that I was very conscious of when I originally wrote the book. There, it was 20 years worth of growth that I had to take a step back and go, wow, I have learned a lot. But then to have that same experience writing the second edition, seeing how much had changed in 3 years, I think it's a very important thing for us to do as human beings. But not just in terms of our blindness skills, but just in terms of our life, in terms of our development as human beings as well. Because we are so, well, what is the old saying that you can't see the wood for the trees? It's very much that we can't see the bigger picture because we're so busy focusing on the here and now, the next challenge, the next problem, the next little bit of things that we have to do. And sometimes just taking that step back can be, excusing the pun, very eye-opening, mind-opening perhaps is a better term. Yeah, I think the other thing that's important there is what you said. I mean, there are constantly people who are going through the journey of losing their sight diminishing from fairly good sight to less sight. And it's a very scary, very lonely place. And being able to provide a resource that maybe helps them just a little bit with that transition, to help that journey, to help their friends and family to understand, to gain perspective of that journey, I think that's important. I have a speaking friend who's a former world champion of public speaking, and he tells the story of giving a speech. And he didn't think the speech had gone overly well, but somebody came up to him and said afterwards, I needed to hear your speech. It was life-changing for me. And even if a tool, a resource, a speech, a podcast, a book, a comment changes one person's awareness of what is possible, then it's made a difference.
That's great. I like that. A different way of seeing a blind woman's journey of living an ordinary life in an extraordinary way. Lois Strachan, one more question for you. What advice would you give to inspiring writers, people who want to look into writing and maybe publishing?
There are so many different reasons for writing. There is an incredible value to be gained from gaining healing through writing. That could be journaling or something like that. There can be a huge amount of insights that one can gain through that. But if you're wanting to actually share your story in a more public way, in terms of publishing a story, I think the biggest thing to know is not to get overwhelmed by the enormity of the task. Take it just one step at a time. And don't expect your first draft to be perfect. You don't have to get every word of every sentence wonderfully correct right from the start. That's why there are people like editors. And adding on to that, I would say I have found the writing community, the author community, the publishing community is one of the most generous communities that I've been part of. And surrounding yourself with people to support, encourage, assist, and motivate and help you when you have those blockages of what do I do next is so important. And if any of your listeners are keen to learn a little bit more, they can always feel free to reach out to me and I'd help where I can.
That's great. Where can people find your blog?
loisstrachan.com.
There you go.
It's simple.
Boom.
Although possibly the best thing to do is to probably just spell it. So it's LoisStrachan, loisstrachan.com.
That's great. People go on to Amazon, go find the book. I did a search. I just put in your name, Lois Strachan, and it popped right up. And that was nice because then I was able to just click on it. A Different Way of Seeing, A Blind Woman's Journey of Living an Ordinary Life in an Extraordinary Way. Second edition. Lois, thank you so much for writing the book. Thank you so much for coming on the Blind Abilities and sharing your story, your book, and a little bit about what got you there. So thank you.
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity to chat to your listeners, Jeff.
You bet.
There's a girl in the mirror, she's there every day. And as I watch her, she's turning away. The girl in the mirror turns out, slowly walks away.
Always a great time talking to Lois Strachan. Be sure to go on to Amazon, check out her new book, A Different Way of Seeing, A Blind Woman's Journey of Living an Ordinary Life in an Extraordinary Way. Second edition. Get your copy, share it with family and friends. It's a great conversation piece, and it's also a great read. And I also want to thank the multi-talented Lois Strachan for letting us use her music on this podcast.
Little Miss Dolly packed her bags and headed for the sun.
And for more podcasts with the blindness perspective, check us out on the web at www.blindabilities.com, on Twitter at blindabilities, and give us a call at 612-367-6093. Leave us a message and let us know if we can put your voice on the next podcast. Drop us an email at info@blindabilities.com. And download the free Blind Abilities app from the App Store and Google Play Store. That's 2 words, Blind Abilities. And from all of us here at Blind Abilities, through these challenging times, to you, your family, and friends, stay well, stay informed, and stay strong. I want to thank you for listening. Hope you enjoyed. And until next time, bye-bye.
When we share
what we see
through each other's eyes, we can then begin to bridge the gap between
the limited expectations and the realities
of blind abilities.
The realities
of blind abilities.
Blind abilities.